So I'm doing I'm launching a three-part mini-series today, because I think what we do well as a church is we're quite good at celebrating and quite good at having fun. And if you're able to come and join us on Easter Sunday, we can prove that to you. The last few years, I mean, we always have like some Prosecco and cakes and some confetti and fun, and it's great. But I feel that we actually need to press into the journey of Jesus, which is why we're doing the Holy Week gatherings. We're going to be taking communion during that time. We're going to be preparing our hearts and thinking about the price and the journey that Jesus went on. And so this three-part mini-series really is, I'm hoping, will speak to two different types of people. Firstly, those who don't really understand the Easter story. I want to try and help us unpack what it is that we celebrate at Easter as Christians, why it is actually the most significant date of the year for us. And then the other person I want to speak to is those that come into church week in, week out. Maybe you've been coming to church for decades, and you know what? It's easy sometimes to go through the motions, and I'm saying that as a pastor. It can be easy to turn up because this is part of our rhythm, and we see friends here, and it's part of what we do. But it can be hard sometimes to stay connected to the reason why we do this. And so I'm hoping that what I'm going to say today is going to help people that don't really know who Jesus is or who Easter is to lean in and to explore. And I'm hoping it's going to help those of us that come here every week just to remember what it is that first caught our attention. So, Father, I pray that what I say will be helpful. I pray, Lord, that it would be for some of us at the beginning of a journey, and for the rest of us, just an ignition whilst we're on that journey. In Jesus' name, amen. So I'm today looking at the evidence of the resurrection. Next week, Zach is going to be speaking about the significance of the cross. And then the following week, Esther's going to be speaking and unpacking Palm Sunday. And before I start, I want to do two book recommendations. The first is The Case for Christ. I don't know if anyone's read this. Written by a guy called Lee Strobel. He was the legal editor of the Chicago Tribune. Wrote this a few years ago. I believe his wife became a Christian, and he set out to write this book to try and disprove Christianity. And so he interviewed a whole bunch of experts and went on this journey of trying to understand what it is and to disprove it, and ended up finding faith. They made this into a movie. I think it was on Amazon Prime. You can watch the movie, and this is a book. If this would be helpful for anyone here who is exploring, then I'd like to give that away now. So first person to come and grab that's there. Anyone? You've got to give it away, Gordon. And then the next one is Frank Morrison, Who Moved the Stone? And Frank Morrison digs into the resurrection of Jesus. And so I'd like to offer that to anyone. This is just really good stuff to give to people to help them explore the reason that we celebrate and the reason that we sing. So here's another book. So please do grab that. If you're more of a watcher or a listener, have you come across Diary of a CEO by Stephen Bartlett? This is the guy that's on Dragon's Den. He's a great communicator. And he had Wes Huff on his podcast recently. It is brilliant. It's a long format, an hour and a half or so, maybe even longer. Wes Huff is a Christian. He's a historian. He's a clever guy. And he answers questions with real grace. I really like him. And Stephen Bartlett says to Wes Huff, how do you take someone like me who agrees that there is clearly something missing, who believes that there is something transcendent? It would be a crazy thing to assume that this is it, I think. How do you take them from this position to believing what is written in the Bible that should guide my life? And so Wes Huff unpacks that. So Diary of a CEO, I'd encourage you to check that out if you're at all interested. So, Sir Lionel Luckhoo, what a brilliant name. Sir Lionel Luckhoo had a reputation for being the most successful lawyer and was actually entered into the Guinness Book of Records because he had 245 consecutive defense murder acquittals. 245 in a row. And of the resurrection of Jesus, he said, I have spent more than 42 years as a defense trial lawyer, appearing in many parts of the world, and am still in active practice. I've been fortunate to secure a number of successes in jury trials, quite modest, and I say unequivocally the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ is so overwhelming that it compels acceptance by proof, which leaves absolutely there were the apostles without Thomas, and then the apostles with Thomas. A beautiful interaction where Thomas, doubting Thomas, one of his best friends, reached in and touched the body of Jesus. There were 7 disciples by the Sea of Galilee. There was this great people at once. Now, you would be right to point out that all these appearances are featured in the Bible. So you could argue that it's biased. It's spinning a story. It wants you to believe its own story. These eyewitnesses are all found in biblical text. But what isn't in question is just how dangerous it was to be a follower of Jesus after his resurrection in Jerusalem. It would have been suicide to have been professing a faith in Jesus at this time. It was extremely dangerous. And what we do know from records within the Bible and outside the Bible is that many of these eyewitnesses willfully and resolutely endured prolonged torture and in many cases death rather than renounce their testimony. According to the historical records within the Bible and outside of the Bible, there were many people recording at the time in the first century. We have many records. Most Christians could end their suffering simply by renouncing their faith. They had an opportunity. Renounce your faith and you will live. But instead it seems that most opted to endure the suffering and proclaim Christ's resurrection unto their own death. Now, martyrdom is remarkable. It's incredible. I can't quite wrap my head around being in that situation. Martyrdom is remarkable, but it's not necessarily compelling. It doesn't validate a belief so much as it authenticates a believer. Let me explain that. These people held to a belief with sincerity. But what makes the earliest Christian martyrs remarkable is that they knew whether or not what they were professing was true. They were first century, first generation believers. They either saw Jesus Christ alive and well after his death, or they didn't. It's one or the other. They either saw him and met with him, or they didn't. And this is extraordinary because if it was just a lie, why would so many perpetuate it given the suffering they were under? Why would they knowingly cling to a belief that was so unprofitable in the face of persecution, imprisonment, torture and death. It makes no sense to me. Many of us will remember where we were on September the 11th, 2001. It's a moment that changed history, changed the way that we live, changed the way that we move around the world. And suicide hijackers undoubtedly believed what they professed, as evidenced by their willingness to die for it. They could not and they did not know if it was true. They put their faith in traditions passed down to them over many generations. In contrast, the early Christian martyrs were the first generation. Either they saw what they claimed or they didn't. Among the most illustrious of the professed eyewitnesses were the apostles, Jesus' best friends. And they went through this extraordinary transformation. They spent 3 years of their lives giving up friendships, giving up trades, giving up everything to follow Jesus. And then he was crucified in front of them, and they deserted him, and they scattered and they hid, and they were terrified for their lives. And then something happens to these people, these ordinary people, salt of the earth, fishermen, tax collectors, these regular people. Something happens to them. They were fearful, they were hidden, they were trembling, they were afraid, they were disillusioned. And then something happened to them that set their hearts ablaze, that caused them to go out and to proclaim the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So that's the first line of evidence, eyewitnesses. The second line of evidence is the conversion of key skeptics. And now I want to focus on two people in particular. Firstly, Paul. Paul was also known as Saul. By his own admission, he was a violent persecutor of the early church. And I've got just a few texts here that show us, and some of them are written by Paul himself, speaking about how he used to live and believe and behave. He says, even though I was formerly a blasphemer and a persecutor and a violent aggressor. He said, for you have heard of my previous way of life in Judaism, how intensely I persecuted the church of God and tried to destroy it. There's even a text of Paul supporting the stoning of a Christian martyr. He was violently opposed to Christians and to Christ. And then he has an encounter with Jesus. Now, his encounter with Jesus is after the crucifixion of Jesus. So his encounter with Jesus can only be with the risen Jesus. And Paul underwent an immediate and drastic change from a vicious persecutor of the church into the most prolific and selfless defender. And like many Christians, Paul suffered for his faith and his belief and his conviction. He suffered impoverishment, persecution, beatings, imprisonment, and execution for his steadfast commitment to Christ's resurrection. What caused this man to change direction so drastically? It couldn't have been a hallucination. That doesn't make sense to me, that somebody's life would turn around so dramatically. And then there was James. James was skeptical, though not as hostile as Paul. And a purported post-resurrection encounter with Christ turned him into an inimitable believer, a leader of the church in Jerusalem. And again, I remind you that Jerusalem was not the place to be as a Christian post-resurrection of Jesus. So, notable skeptics, their lives turned around. Eyewitnesses, skeptics. And the third line of evidence for Christ's resurrection, the empty tomb. It would have been impossible for faith in Jesus' resurrection to take root in Jerusalem whilst his body was still in the tomb. it wouldn't have made sense for this story to rise up how it did. When news of sightings started to spread, when people started to speak, when rumours were starting to go across the land that Jesus was alive, the Sanhedrin, which is the religious council, the people that essentially condemned Jesus to death, what they could have done was exhumed the body. They could have gone into the tomb, exhumed the body, put it on display and exposed the hoax. Yet they couldn't, and they didn't, because there was no body. So how do we explain the empty tomb? Well, firstly, the Sanhedrin accused the disciples of stealing the body. But this poses a serious question. How could they steal the body under Roman guard? It wouldn't have been easy. But more importantly, if the disciples did steal the body, they would have known that the resurrection was a hoax. They would have known that it wasn't true. They would therefore not have been so willing to suffer and die for it. As Wes Huff says, liars make poor martyrs. I think that's a really profound thought. All of the professed eyewitnesses would have known that they hadn't really seen Christ and were therefore lying. The other possible explanation for the empty tomb is called the swoon theory. You might have heard of this. This is where people suggested that Jesus faked his death and later escaped from the tomb. And this just doesn't hold any serious weight. According to the eyewitness testimony, and there's no question about the authenticity of Roman records. Don't forget, Jesus came at a time when society was actually really well advanced. Communication was well developed, and the way that people travelled around was well established. According to the eyewitness testimony, Jesus Christ was beaten, was tortured, was lacerated and stabbed. He suffered internal damage, massive blood loss, asphyxiation, and a spear through his side. There's no good reason to believe that Jesus, or anyone else for that matter, could survive such an ordeal, fake his death, sit in a tomb for 3 days with no medical attention, no food or water, remove the massive stone which sealed his tomb, and escape undetected without leaving a trail of blood behind him. Then convince hundreds of eyewitnesses that he was resurrected from the dead and in good health, and then disappear without a trace. It doesn't seem to me to make much sense. Also, add to this that Roman executioners were really good at what they did. They really knew how to kill someone. Crucifixion was extremely thorough. People didn't pretend they were dead. There's also this little detail in the Bible which I think is so beautiful because it's so accurate, yet it's really easy to miss. In John 19:34, it says, when they came to Jesus and found that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. Instead, one of the soldiers pierced Jesus' side with a spear, bringing a sudden flow of blood and water. The man who saw it was given testimony, and his testimony is true. That's all right. Just in case you missed it, he was speared in the side. He was speared in the side, bringing a sudden flow of blood and water. Now, it's easy to miss this detail, and it's understood that they didn't understand at the time of writing the significance of what this meant. But according to medical knowledge, I'm not a doctor, but I've researched this. When a person dies, especially a traumatic death like crucifixion, the pericardium is a sac of liquid that forms around the heart and around the lungs, and it contains fluid. And forensic pathologists note that post-mortem stabbing of the heart, so when somebody is dead and their heart is stabbed, a bit gruesome, I'm sorry, this produces exactly what the Bible talks about, a sudden flow of separated blood and water. It can only happen when somebody has died. So this tiny detail in the biblical text is another body of evidence that Jesus was truly dead, making the swoon theory medically implausible. Fourth line of evidence, we're nearly there. There's this peculiarity with the first people that witnessed the empty tomb, that discovered that Jesus wasn't there, that he was alive. All of the major resurrection narratives, it's women who first see Jesus. They are the first eyewitnesses. And this would be an odd invention, since in both ancient Jewish and ancient Roman culture, women were severely disregarded. Their testimony wasn't valid in court. It was considered insubstantial and dismissible. Dr. William Lane Craig explains, when you understand the role of women in first century Jewish society, what's really extraordinary is that this empty tomb story should feature women as the discoverers of the empty tomb in the first place. Women were on a very low rung on the social ladder in first century Israel. There's an old rabbinical saying that says, let the words of law be burned rather than delivered to women. And blessed is he whose children are male, but woe to him whose children are female. Thankfully, we've moved on. We're in a different place now. But the point needs to be made. Women's testimony was regarded as so worthless that they weren't even allowed to serve as legal witnesses in a Jewish court of law. William Lane Craig goes on to say, in light of this, it's absolutely remarkable that the chief witnesses to the empty tomb are these women. Any later legendary account would have certainly portrayed male disciples as discovering the tomb, Peter or John, for example. The fact that women are the first witnesses to the empty tomb is most plausibly explained by the reality that, like it or not, they were the discoverers of the empty tomb. This shows that the gospel writers faithfully recorded what happened, even if it was embarrassing, that it was women that first saw Jesus. So that's a really quick overview. 4 lines of evidence. I encourage you to read the books, to listen to that podcast. I encourage you to lean into this. If you're undecided about Jesus, explore the scriptures. Explore your heart. Consider what it might mean for you. And I want to say also, for anyone here who ever carries any element of doubt, that it's okay. It's okay to be a Christian and to have doubts. As a pastor, as a professional Christian, I sometimes have doubts when things don't go how I'm hoping them to go. I sometimes doubt, where are you, God? Are you real? But then when I read this stuff, when I explore the scriptures, when I think about the impact of those first disciples and the change in their lives, going from depressed and disillusioned, hidden away, fearful of their lives, to going and carrying a message of hope about the resurrected Jesus, I can put my doubts aside and I can worship Jesus with authenticity and with hope in my heart that he is alive. And that's why we celebrate Easter, because the resurrection was true. Esther.